Welcome back to part 2 of our video series covering the history of federalism, origins of federalism, and the Articles of Confederation. So again, you're going to get to this as part of a book assignment. I'm not sure if it's number 2 or number 3, but let's delve into it now. So Congress, during our battle for independence and afterwards, between these years, 1774 and 1781, this is out of your book too, by the way, really directs the states to form their own governments. The Declaration of Independence is adopted. Thomas Jefferson and Company get that out and published. The Articles of Confederation are drafted. They're ratified by the individual states in 1781. So, what is this? What are these Articles of Confederation? What did they do for the country? So the first government we had, it was really sort of a firm league of friendship, a direct quote. And each state kept the vast majority of its powers. It was, again, as I explained in the last part of the series, part 1, that it was like we had 13 little countries. You know, everybody kept their sovereignty, their freedom, independence, every power, jurisdiction, and right that wasn't expressly delegated in the Articles of Confederation to the United States in Congress assembled. So anything that wasn't explicitly mentioned, the states kept. And this led to a whole lot of trouble. We only had one legislative chamber back then. Each state had one vote, so they might send, however many delegates, say 10 delegates, but they would have to agree. They'd have their own system of voting, but state by state by state, and they'd come up with an answer. Maybe they'd reach a majority. 6 of the 10 delegates would say yes to a proposition, and that would be what, say, Delaware voted on whatever, just in that made-up scenario. We didn't have an executive or judicial branch like we know today. We still kind of had it. The president of the Congress was the highest civilian post that could be held during that time. That was kind of like the executive. I mean, very roughly speaking. And we had foreign affairs, the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of Finance, the Department of War. These departments would later on become, Foreign Affairs would become state, Finance would become Treasury. The Department of War existed for many, many years, till about the 30s or 40s, and then became the Department of Defense. So the powers that were granted, and again, I'll mention it again for the last time, if the font is somehow differentiated, like you see the powers here are in red, that might show up on a test, hint, hint. So they had the power to declare war. They had the power to send and receive ambassadors. They had the power to make treaties in this federal government under the Articles of Confederation. Now, they didn't entirely throw the baby out with the bathwater, as a lot of this stuff should be familiar to you, or sound familiar anyway. They could build and equip an Army and Navy, and we've stretched that out to an Air Force, the Coast Guard, the Space Force. Be interested to see how that develops. And they controlled maritime or oceanic affairs. They regulated trade with the Indians. They borrowed money. I mean, this stuff should be very familiar sounding to you, but these are some of the things that could be done by the federal government under the Articles of Confederation. So I'll give you 2 seconds to look at that. All right, and we're moving on. So the articles weren't an entirely a wasteful thing. We fought a war with the world power at the time, Great Britain. We negotiated a peace with them. One very powerful allies received foreign aid from the Dutch are coming to my head right now. John Adams. They went to Holland, negotiated with the Dutch for some foreign aid, and established new trade partners. We built an army, built a navy, we created a postal system. Thank you, Dr. Franklin. And we laid the foundation for a lot of what we have today in terms of a national bureaucracy. So this was a good thing in a lot of ways that we started here and that this happened. Now the downsides, we didn't have any sort of national identity, no sense of national unity. There were 13 different nation states that were bound together in a defense pact, essentially. And that didn't really work too well after the war. Didn't really work too well during the war either, but that's another story. The states, again, retained their sovereignty, their power. The federal government couldn't compel them to do anything that they didn't want to do, such as pay their taxes. No revenue through taxation. Congress could make the ask of Pennsylvania, say, hey, you owe us $100,000 in debt from the war. Pennsylvania could say, oh, no, I don't, and not pay. And there was no recourse. That was the end of the discussion. And there was no trade regulation. So every one of the 13 states could hypothetically, I don't believe this happened, could have made their own trade deals with a country like, say, Mexico. So all 13 of the states, of the original states, could have made their own trade regulations with Mexico. There was no, on completely separate terms, completely separate ways. Nobody was there to regulate that, to say, this is, in the interest of the country. And they couldn't regulate the currency. Many states printed their own currency. So, it made travel very hard. If you had to go from Maryland to Virginia, you'd have to trade your dollars. And as a consequence, the economies of these these little countries, these states, these 13 states, were not stable by any means. So there were a lot of weaknesses too, but it wasn't an entirely terrible exercise. And because, again, there was no revenue through taxation or no trade regulation, America couldn't repay her debts, which led to a lot of problems, and that's even trickled down to today. So we realized that the time was ripe for change. We needed a different form of government, or the Articles of Confederation at a minimum needed to be fixed, and in a hurry. So we come to the Annapolis Convention and Shays' Rebellion. So in 1786, 5 states only, that was what they could get. They sent delegates to discuss the problems with the Articles of Confederation, especially in regards to trade. And they passed a resolution at this convention calling for another convention to discuss the broader problems other than trade the next May in Philadelphia. And this is what became the Constitutional Convention, and where we got the document that we have and cherish today. So while this was happening between the Annapolis Convention and the Constitutional Convention, Shays' Rebellion occurs. So protests were held by debtors, and really they threatened the state's leaders. More and more people really began to see the need for a stronger central government. So Daniel Shays' rebellion was certainly a precipitating factor that motivated the Confederation Congress to endorse a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. And as you know, because we're now in 2021, they did much more than revise the Articles of Confederation. So the Constitutional Convention happens from May to September of 1787, and the states all appointed delegates to attend, and they created the federal government that we know today, with the concept of federalism, which we've discussed. Again, if you need to review, go back to part 1, where I cover the different types of systems in some detail. And they create a national government. They have the executive, the judicial, the legislative branches. There's a separation of power there, certainly, with checks and balances. So the founders gave us a federal system in which the power of the government is divided between what happens in what eventually became Washington, D.C., and the states. And there are different types of powers. This is very important that you remember this. Article 6 in the U.S. Constitution is referred to as the National Supremacy Clause. It gives the national government, well, as the name says, supremacy over the states, over the municipalities, rather. Section 2 says the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. So it's, the Constitution is above state law, is above your town charter, whatever it is that you care to name. So Marbury versus Madison, the Chief Justice, John Marshall, and we're going to study this case in depth when we get to the judiciary, established that the U.S. Supreme Court could exercise judicial review and determine what is or is not constitutional. That was a big deal, but don't worry about that now. We'll get to that when we hit the judiciary, which will not be covered on this test. So, the 10th Amendment, again, another hint whenever you see an amendment on this test, on these slides, in this class, in a video, wherever, I promise you, it'll show up on the test. So the 10th Amendment says, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. So this is the Constitution speaking on federalism. If it's not in the United States Constitution, if the Constitution doesn't say the federal government can do it, or the states can't do it, well, the states can go ahead and perform whatever function, or the people can if the states don't have a law about that. So the Supremacy Clause, again, establishes the U.S. Constitution as the supreme law of the land. Now, this is just kind of the hierarchy of laws here. You have the U.S. Constitution. So this creates a legislative branch and an executive branch that can make acts of Congress and treaties. Now, acts of Congress and federal treaties are all well and good, but again, I kind of distinguish the system as it should be written in the Constitution, what we've got, and I mean, these are leaps and bounds away. The acts of Congress and treaties have to line up with what's in the Constitution. If these congressional acts and treaties go against what's in the Constitution, they're no good. And the same with states' constitutions. The federal government demanded once upon a time that states form their own governments that are all pretty much like the federal government. and form their own constitution. So the states have to, the states do that, and they have to look at congressional acts and treaties and the Constitution, see if they're violating anything. If they're not, great. The state constitution stands. If they are, then they need to go back to the drawing board. Same with state statutes. So laws that the state legislatures pass, and then county and city, and it goes down further. So this is the hierarchy here of laws. It's just what I call it. It's not I don't know that this has an official name. So the federal Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, this is upside down. Okay, this little book here gives delegated powers to the national government. I would remember that term, delegated powers. States are given reserved powers via the 10th Amendment. So again, to reiterate the 10th Amendment, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And the Anti-Federalists, which were one of our beginning political parties, there were the Federalists, so in opposition there were the Anti-Federalists. They insisted that there be a Bill of Rights to protect the states from an overreaching, tyrannical central government. And this was a big fight at the time. We'll go into this story a little later. So there are different powers here. The national government, and this is certainly, I'm certainly going to pull some test questions from here. Certainly. The national government can coin money. The state government cannot. It's not a concurrent power either. They can make treaties. Illinois does not have the power to make its own treaty with Canada. That's a power expressly in here given to the federal government. They can regulate a postal system. They can make war. They can make all necessary and proper laws to fulfill the responsibilities. Their responsibilities should be of what's listed in the Constitution. Again, the system it's set up, and the system is how it's run. They don't correlate necessarily, and there are powers that are denied. So they can't tax, the federal government can't tax state exports. They can't change state boundaries arbitrarily. They can't also impose a religious test. And they certainly can't pass laws that are in conflict with the Bill of Rights. Some of these concurrent powers. And if you, I believe I adjusted it so that you could see what you said on the pretests now. Now, if you got it wrong, you got the question wrong. There were two that asked, what is a power of the state government? What is a power of the federal government? They're asking for, delegated and enumerated powers. So if you said tax, you would have gotten that question wrong. So states and Washington can also make and enforce laws, administer a judiciary. We have state courts, we have federal courts. Take property through eminent domain. State governments also run elections. Again, as I said before, it would be awful. We wouldn't know who won anything if Washington, D.C. was administering our elections. They can establish a Republican form of government. They can regulate commerce, state within their state, within their boundary lines. And the 10th Amendment, certainly. All powers not delegated to the national government are denied to states by the Constitution. And the powers denied to them should look familiar because a lot of them are listed over here. So I would certainly remember this chart and some of these questions, some of these powers, because that's certainly going to show up on your first test.